Assalamu alaikum ji. Welcome to another PIDE seminar. I'm very happy to have Adeel Malik here. I've known Adeel for a long time. MashaAllah, he's grown up to be a very good scholar and in Oxford, doing very well, and frequently comes out with some good papers. So when he told me he was coming to Pakistan, I immediately grabbed the opportunity and invited him to come and give a talk. And I'm sure he'll give us a presentation that'll, at least create some thoughts in our mind, which is what this seminar is all about. Educating each other and provoking us to debate. His topic is very interesting. Islam and politics of development. How Pakistan's historically embedded elites undermine long-run development. I think that'll be fascinating. So, without further ado, I'll ask Adeel to make a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nadeem Haque, for this kind invitation. Coming to PIDE is always a homecoming because I was educated at Qaid-e-Azam University in the economics department, and as students we used to draw more heavily on the library here at PIDE than other places. So these corridors are very familiar. Now with the sective seminar series, I could see there's a lot of more active engagement in terms of ideas. I would like to start by apologizing for the delay. I no longer understand Islamabad's roads very well, so I didn't time it properly. But anyway, we are here, and I'm thankful to you for waiting for this presentation to start. The genesis of this paper actually is the Pakistan support program from IFPRI, and I think it's quite an opportune moment that I'm presenting it here, because Dr. Nadeem Haque was very key in starting that project. I remember, Dr. Nadeem, you played a very important role in the program. I remember at that time, Dr. Nadeem used to emphasize that we give a lot of money to consultants, but we need to have competitive support program, as part of which different papers could be prepared with more solid research. Now, the overall, Dr. Nadeem will be interested to hear that the overall cost for this project was about $30,000. We've created a database, it's creating debate. There are 3 papers out of it. I think is more than what any consultant would get. And there's a new Oxford Handbook on Politics of Muslim Societies, which is also covering it, is part of various reading lists, and we are now in the process of submitting it to a journal. Now, the overall remit of this paper is very simple. It's to take a hypothesis that exists in our different books on Pakistan's historically embedded elites, particularly those elites for whom 3 forces combine to create a structural advantage: control over religion, control over land, and control over politics. And by this I mean to say this paper is largely about shrine elites, those religious shrines that are historically embedded, in other words, that were recognized by the British district gazetteers. And growing up in a literary household, my father always used to say, well, one of the key constraints to literacy promotion is these historically embedded power structures. Then I grew to become a young scholar working with Mahbubul Haque. He always was very emphatic on that issue as well. So when I got this project approved by the Planning Commission and the IFPRI Competitive Grants Program, I thought, well, let's try and explore that hypothesis. And in that process, what we did was to collect historical data on the universe of religious shrines in the Punjab region, and combine that with information from historical district gazetteers. Each of the district gazetteer contains a page called Religious Fairs and Festivals, in which it details the number of shrines that are historically significant. And these shrines are very important because the British, when they recognized a shrine or a shrine family, were more likely to give them land grants. We then combined it with data on the political presence of these shrine families, and we compiled a historic panel of literacy, which starts from 1901, keeping the historic boundaries fixed, going all the way down to 2011 from various census rounds. The last 2 observations we get from the multiple indicator cluster survey. So I'm trying to give a brief overview of the paper before I get into the technicalities, so that you're not lost in the details. And then our basic question was, are shrine-dense regions, or regions with a greater concentration of historic shrines, do they have significantly different trajectory of literacy compared to others? And the basic finding, the one-point finding of this paper is that, yes, indeed, shrine-dense regions have witnessed a dramatically lower growth in literacy relative to non-shrine regions. But this effect is not uniform over time. It only kicks in after Ziaul Haque's military coup. So the academic version of this paper, therefore, is called Pre-Colonial Religious Institutions and Development, Evidence Through a Military Coup. So then the question is, why do we see a dramatic divergence in the trajectories of literacy post Ziaul Haque's military coup? And there we draw on this massive shock in the allocation of public goods, where post-Zia, a lot of the public goods, including schooling, came to be delivered through MPAs and M&As, especially in terms of development expenditures. And then the final part of the paper really deals with the question of, okay, if there is such a strong and consistent evidence on the literacy deficit in shrine-dense regions, what mechanisms do they rely on to undermine literacy? So that's the basic remit of the paper. Let's press ahead. Now, in each economics paper, it's obviously on Pakistan, but you need to situate it. And I know there are lots of students here. When you're writing your papers, you have to provide a theoretical hook. What is the larger literature within which this could make an important contribution? And the way we frame this paper is to really think about informal institutions. And religious beliefs are actually part of what we call informal institutions, right? And there's a lot of work on formal institutions, but relatively little on what role beliefs, norms, belonging, what role do they play. If you follow Quarterly Journal of Economics, last month it put together 6 or 7 articles on economics of religion. It's a fast expanding field, because while people know a lot about formal institutional structures, there's very little understanding on how religion plays an important role. Now, prior work on religion has largely been concentrated on the role of culture and social norms, right? Religious beliefs are recognized as being important, but not much work has been done. Douglas North himself, for example, one of the earlier scholars who worked on the importance of institutions, talked about religious beliefs as enabling, motivating, guiding human behavior. He talked about the importance of moral and ethical behavioral norms, but that was it. There's hardly any empirical study that looks at it in more detail. What we are going to rely on in this paper is this important insight by another important scholar on informal institutions. His name is Avner Greif from Stanford. And he made an important observation when he said that the impact of a society's self-enforcing informal institutions is conditioned by history, because all of these informal institutions, including religious institutions, are embedded in history, and their impact unfolds through an interplay with formal institutional structures, because religious beliefs or informal institutions do not sit idly. They are part of a larger institutional apparatus, and their effect unfolds in constant interaction with formal institutional structures. And we are going to use both of these insights in identifying the impact of shrines. The empirical challenge, however, in the study of informal institutions is that it is very difficult to measure them, right? People do randomized controlled trials, they do behavioral experiments to learn about the role of religion, but more or less a key constraint is absence of data. And so you have Helm and Levitsky's quote here about informal institutions being difficult to measure because there's issues of identification, measurement, how you compare. Now, in this paper, we, as I just mentioned before, I'm going to skip this. This paper, we are going to look at the role of shrines, which we measure using historical data set. Now, this is the sort of part that I tell people who don't know about the Pakistani context very much. I think most people in this room know how important shrines are. But just to remind you of a very interesting book, which again economists need to read outside their discipline too, because a lot of the interesting hypotheses exist outside the economics book, and especially in your context. So I came across this very fascinating book by David Gilmartin, Empire and Islam in Punjab, in which he talks about these big religious shrines as informal institutions par excellence, and he describes them as symbolic cultural outposts of the power of Islam and the Muslim state in Punjab. And of course, you know that in large parts of Punjab, Islam spread through the presence and teachings of the Sufis, right? So they were the prime force in the spread of Islam. So in that process, they acquired tremendous legitimacy with their local population. And in their local context, they're doing many things. If you go to any shrine, including Barimam, which is very close by, or Golra Sharif, they're distributors of local welfare. They are, have religious festivals, market fairs, charitable economy. But a lot of the work in Islamic studies and history has looked at religious authority. People like Barbara Metcalf, Francis Robinson, David Gilmartin. These people have talked about the religious authority, the construction and maintenance of religious authority in these shrines. What they did not talk about is the political economy of these shrines. And this is the first paper that actually tackles that question from a specific dimension. Now, why political economy is important? Because we know you cannot map rural Punjab's economic and political power structure without looking at shrines. For example, before the elections, you would have followed, Sial Sharif and his activity in politics. Even Prime Minister Imran Khan's wife belongs to Pakpatan, right? Shah Mahmud Qureshi, our foreign minister, Khusro Bakhtiar. I mean, these are old figures, household names, who are big controllers of religion, land, and politics, right? And you cannot map Punjab's power structure or political economy without accounting for the role of these very powerful religious elites. Now, why do we think that education is an important aspect to think about this? And to do this, I go back to some of the literature. Some of you might have heard of The Punjab Peasant, a very famous book by Sir Malcolm Darling, in which he talked about how the landlord and the peer are instinctively opposed to the two movements from which the ordinary cultivator has most to hope. Neither education nor cooperation has their sympathy, for both strike at the regime which it is their one object to maintain. There are lots of other studies. For example, KKZ's goes further and says, look, education is the veil of ignorance might push some of his spiritual slaves out of their prison of superstition. He's talking about how education is central to the power of the shrine elites. And this is easy to understand because a lot of the network of devotees of these shrine aristocrats shift their political allegiances, make their key decisions based on shrine families' support. And so this is a highly portable network of devotees, right? They can vote for any party. And to keep the dense social network around the shrine, education obviously means that you can migrate. It provides you exposure to non-agricultural opportunities. It affects your cognitive structure, because any question of power is not just about coercion, it's also about obedience and reciprocity, because the powerful always wants the subjects to respond through the cognitive structure as well, right, and have voluntary compliance. And so that's why we treat these informal institutions as self-enforcing institutions. So there is a lot of qualitative evidence that suggests that these elites should be averse to literacy promotion, but these are just hypotheses, right? These are observations. And as economists, we want to see, okay, we want to use these observations to systematically test them in the data and see if there's any support for such things. Now, economically, obviously, if I'm making this argument in an economics paper, I have to use the economics jargon and think through the tools of economics. And one of the ways in which we need to think about the shrine opposition to education is that they have greater incentive, but potentially greater capacity to oppose schooling. We know they're averse because it is a threat to their regime of voluntary obedience. But they may also have a greater ability because given the hierarchical social structure around these shrines, they might be better able to resist the pressures for mass schooling. What remains to be shown is whether such a link exists, and two, if it does exist, what mechanisms they might use. Now, there's a paper by Mehwish Shami that looks at collective action around common interest resources. Education is a common interest resource, right? It's a public good. And collective action around education resources could be particularly challenging in those areas where shrine elites enjoy greater bargaining power with respect to their constituents. They possess superior capacity to break horizontal ties amongst population. And of course, they are subjected to fewer sanctions given their religious status. Okay, now for those of us who know about Punjab's context or Sindh's context, this paper is specifically on Punjab. We know that peers or spiritual overlords command the undivided loyalty of their followers, right? And devotees of shrines constitute a ready-made network that could be deployed in politics and other domains. The important thing, however, is that these are also zamindars. That's why K.K. Aziz, one of the famous historians in Pakistan, described them as peer zamindars, because they control both religious resources, but they also have control over land, right? Most of the people that I talked about are not only in politics, they not only have affiliated with major shrines, they also have large tracts of land. And what's interesting in this context is that the state has always looked to these shrine aristocrats as intermediaries. And it's not just the current Pakistani state or the British. It was true in the Sikh period, it was also true in the Mughal period, when far-flung areas, at that time when roads were few and far between, you needed to depend on those brokers or intermediaries to rule those subjects. And that meant patronizing them. And in most of these cases, they would give them land grants. But under the Mughals, land was given to these families. It would always revert back to the state upon the death of the saint. The British changed this in a radical way through the 1901 Land Alienation Act, in which they established property rights for the first time in Punjab. But these were restrictive property rights. Not everyone could own land or sell land. There's a book by Punjab Under Imperialism by Imran Ali, which details this very well. But the basic idea was that you can only sell land to what the British described as agrarian castes. Now, who is going to be part of the agrarian caste is itself a very discretionary process. And in fact, there were debates in the British archives whether the shrine aristocrats could be considered as agrarian castes. And they said, well, they're not truly agrarian castes, but we will consider them as such because they're very important for ruling this place. Which meant that once you're part of the agrarian caste, you will be fit for landed gentry grants. Okay, so you can get large tracts of lands. For example, in one of the settlement reports that I found in British Library in London, the Montgomery settlement report talks about 1,900 acres of land given to Daud Bandagi Nokara. Jugnu Mohsin, one of our MPAs and wife of Najm Sethi, is linked to that major shrine family. So a lot of these families actually receive land grants, and that became very important because once religion and land together created, made hereditary succession of shrines as a powerful economic proposition, because now you are also a controller of land. And one of the arguments that I'm going to make is that just before partition, when the British opened the doors for electoral competition, many of these shrine aristocrats were fit to participate in politics. They were they were natural contenders for it. So, for example, if you think about the role of peers in politics, it's clear that in political power, as anthropologists would describe, three key factors are important: number, resources, your ability to organize. All these three aspects are very much present when it comes to describing these shrines. Anatole Levin's book, for example, talks about how it is not wealth alone, but wealth plus either kinship, biradari or other, or spiritual lineage, or both, that gives political power. K.K. Aziz talks about how a medium-sized shrine makes him a small landowner and a local squire. The big shrine gives him an entry into the Zamindar club and catapults him into the aristocratic category and brings him riches large enough to enter politics at the highest level. So you could see that religion, together with land ownership and gradual entry and persistence into politics, creates a powerful structural inequality that could have potentially important consequences for development. If you look at the persistence of these shrine families in politics, look at the last bullet point, right? In the 1921 Provincial Assembly, they represented 19% of the total number of seats. And despite urbanization, lots of changes that have come about in over 100 years, the ratio is currently around 16%. It hasn't really come down dramatically. So you're talking about elites that have persisted in politics for very long periods of time. Now, what we are going to argue here is that although shrines were active throughout this period, they did not directly control the provision of public goods. They could indirectly influence through bureaucrats. The 1977 coup is a key period because it both catapulted a lot of these elites more into politics, and secondly, they placed, since the 1985 local bodies elections, resources were placed directly in the hands of MNAs and MPAs. And so you could see greater politicization of schooling, which means that not only many of these historically embedded elites have greater incentives to post-schooling, they also have now greater ability because there are a lot more resources in their hands. I'll talk about it in a little while. Now here's a plot that gives us some, we haven't controlled for anything, it's just basically looking at, those tehsils. This is all tehsil level analysis. All those tehsils where shrines per capita are above the 75th percentile, the darker line, and the lighter is one which is below 75th percentile. And so you could see that post 1977, literacy has grown obviously throughout Punjab, but it's grown by much less in shrine regions. But we haven't controlled for anything. We are going to now look at how
can you go back to this?
Yes. Yes. So this is just a evolution of literacy over time, and ultimately we are going to look at, we are going to test this framework in this. So let's think about why 1977 is a major turning point for us in thinking about the impact of literacy, shrines on literacy. The first thing is to recognize that the military takeover was not, elections were held on a non-party basis, which means your biradri, kinship group, religious status, these things become a lot more important. And so I'm going to show you evidence that shrine leads participated more vigorously in elections post-1977. And the second factor is really control over public goods allocation that I'll also explain. Now, as economists, we need to think about identification strategy. And to do that, what we are going to do is first to set out what specification. We use a very simple specification in a panel data set. Literacy is the literacy rate in Tehsil I and year T. It's a panel, so if you're working with historical data, a key constraint for you as students, if you're working on these kinds of data sets, is administrative boundaries change. So we had to keep the administrative boundaries fixed in 1901. Okay, and there is an appendix to the paper that explains. Then it's a simple difference in different specification where you have shrines I, this is the number of shrines per capita per 10,000 people recorded in district gazetteer. Because the district gazetteers provide you systematic information, we could compile for each tehsil number of shrines recognized by the British as being important in that tehsil, okay, per capita. Into post is a dummy indicator, and we believe that the effect should really kick in post 1977. We control for tehsil level fixed effects because there are certain tehsils, all tehsils have unobserved characteristics that are fixed over time. We need to control for those. We control for time effects, and we control for a whole range of controls. So for example, a key challenge for this paper is to say, okay, there are landed elites and there are religious landed elites. To what extent the effect that we capture is attributable to shrines and not to those landed elites. So we have to control for land inequality in each of the regressions. We also control for initial literacy rate, because it's possible, and we know we have a lot of evidence in education economics that suggests that regions that start with lower level of literacy might have a different trajectory, right? So your starting level of literacy is an important correlate of future literacy. So we control for 1931 literacy rate. When you set up an identification setup like this to identify the impact of shrines, you not only need to ensure that it's not capturing the effect of land inequality, you also need to ensure that there are no locational decisions that determine the influence of shrines. So for example, it is possible that early patterns of shrine location were such that they were more located in those places that were likely to be poorer, hence lower demand for literacy, and so therefore it's just a spurious relation, because shrines ended up settling down, shrine families ended up settling down in those regions that were underdeveloped to begin with. So we control for a lot of geographic factors like elevation, latitude, longitude. We control from distance from Delhi. We control for distance from river. Both of these are important drivers of shrine location. And we also test whether this effect, if shrines were systematically located in those regions that were predisposed to lower levels of literacy, then the effect of shrines should be negative for the universe of shrines, not just the shrines that are mentioned in district gazetteers. So we try a lot of these tests, and as students you need to think about identification as an important concern. So there are three components of the identification strategy. The first is that there's variation in the density of historic shrines across tehsils, right? The second component of identification is that there's temporal variation in literacy. Over time, in some tehsils, literacy has grown more than others. Thirdly, is that of course this provides us treatment control framework. All those shrines that were mentioned in district gazetteers are treated tehsils, the others are controlled tehsils. And then you could look at the difference between the treated groups and the non-treated groups. You could see there's a lot of variation. This is tehsil level variation in the presence of shrines across the various tehsils of Punjab. There's quite a lot of variation across tehsils, which obviously would be crucial for identifying artifact, because as social scientists we're interested in understanding heterogeneity and understanding patterns of variation. The second component I've already mentioned is the 1977 military coup. Somebody could argue it's the shrine elites that brought the coup. When I'm giving this paper in Oxford and other places, I need to explain that more, but people in this context know a lot more that the coup was a very complex factor, and shrine elites in particular were not the driving force behind it. Some of them might be part of the PNA movement, but that's not what was causing the coup. So we could treat the coup as relatively exogenous to the sort of factors we are analyzing, and then the interaction will identify the impact of shrines. All right, the third aspect of the identification strategy is that what changes after the coup is a shock that affects all tehsils, not just shrine tehsils. What's the shock? It's the shock in the allocation of public goods. The system of public goods provision changed radically in the 1980s, as part of which MPAs and MNAs started getting grants, right? They will have direct access to resources. And it was not just shrine elites who will get access to these resources. All elected MNAs and MPAs can in principle have access, although disbursements could vary. So again, it's a shock that's universal, and we use that universal shock to identify the impact of shrines. Okay, so I've already explained to you how we constructed the data. One of the difficulties I found, Dr. Nadeem, is that we have very limited investment either by donors or by governments in creating panel data sets. And unless we have good panel data sets, and we're talking about a very basic panel data on literacy, ideally we should have literacy by village level over time, so that we could track how different characteristics that define villages or tehsils or union councils shape different patterns of literacy. But the best we could do was tehsil level, because everything in Punjab is district level, although now there's a lot more data being collected on that. Okay, I've explained that. I'm going to sorry, I think this is very it's not very legible, but let me explain the broader result, what I'm showing here is the coefficient of the post-coup dummy multiplied by shrines per capita. The idea is this coefficient captures if there was a differential increase or differential growth in literacy post 1977 coup. A negative and statistically significant coefficient suggests that in shrine dense regions literacy grew by much less compared to others after Ziaul Haq's military coup, right? And all of these controls are telling us if you control for total literacy rate, proportion of canal area, because this is a region where canal colonization was very important, so you need to control for that factor. There are a lot of confounding factors that could compete with your explanation, so you need to conclude for those. Distance to river, elevation, distance to Delhi, high shrine dummy. And we do lots of different tests as well, which I'll show you in a minute. We also showed that actually this effect is true for both male and female literacy, and in a sense the effects are slightly stronger for female literacy that I've explained. Overall, we find that about 10% increase in the number of historic shrines per 1,000 persons translates into significant drop, about 25% decline in literacy post 1977, which is quite substantial, and is a larger effect for female schooling. This plot is the paper in a plot, the whole paper summarized in a plot. It's basically, all these numbers are the coefficients. Each number is the coefficient. This is a flexible specification plot where we explore the impact of literacy, of shrines on literacy by each period. And you could see that prior to this dotted line, which is the 1977 coup period, the confidence intervals include 0, which means there's really no systematic difference between shrine and non-shrine regions in terms of literacy prior to the military coup. It is only after the coup that you could see there's a persistent decline. It recovers a little bit, but it remains negative. And it remains persistently negative and significant, which means that the historic impact, the impact of these historic shrines remains latent until the coup. And then it is that interaction with the coup that really produces the effect. And again, I'll go back to Avner Greif's argument that if you're looking at the impact of these informal institutions, it's conditioned by history, but its effect unfolds through an interaction with formal institutional structures. And coup is an important aspect that's kind of animating the impact. Now, an important part of any exercise is to show that there were no differences in other characteristics between shrine and non-shrine regions prior to the coup. So this is what we call test for pre-trends, right? So for example, is it the case that regions that have had more shrines had different literacy in the pre-1977 period? Maybe they were already on a different trajectory, and what we are capturing is that trajectory. We do not find any statistically significant difference. In fact, shrine and non-shrine regions were fairly similar trajectories in terms of literacy. Another is that perhaps the growth in literate population could be different in these regions prior to the coup. Again, we do not find any systematic evidence to support that. Maybe in these regions there were different kind of schooling infrastructure which results in a different growth in literacy after the coup. Again, if you look at schools per 1,000 persons, total, primary, middle, there's no systematic difference prior to the coup in these characteristics. And so overall we find that there are no systematic differences in literacy prior to the coup. It is only after the coup that we see these systematic differences emerging, and we attribute this to the main shock that was introduced through the public goods provision. We also show that in these regions there is indeed both total enrollment rate and primary enrollment rates are lower in these regions. I'm sorry, these are not very legible, but overall you could see that there's a negative statistically significant effect, at least for total and primary enrollment. In these regions, few students are enrolled on average. Okay, so if you want to sell a paper like this, if you're showing the main results, but you're not showing the mechanisms, none of the referees is going to approve the paper. They're not going to believe it. So whenever you are demonstrating a result, you then need to take a further step and say, okay, I've got a very strong hypothesis, I've got a very strong pattern of empirical results, but I need to now demonstrate what potential mechanisms might explain it. And we emphasize three key mechanisms. One is that is the same point, that schooling resources are directly placed in the hands of elected politicians. But above that is the fact that now a lot more shrine elites are vigorously participating in elections. So if you look at elections of these shrine elites, so here's this number of candidates who are participating who are actually winning. You could see since the 1970, it dips off a little bit after 1990, but pre-1977, there's a very different pattern of political participation. Post 1977, you could see there's been a dramatic increase in the number of shrine winners in assemblies. Also, if you look at shrine contestants per constituency, sorry, I think the scales are missing, but the first bar is 1977, the second one is 1985, and then 88, and so on. So you could see, even if you were to scale it by constituency, like shrine contestants per constituency, there's been a radical increase since the 1970s. So I think that's the second key aspect we highlight, that non-party based elections propelled a lot of these shrine elites directly into electoral politics in ways that was more kind of pronounced compared to previous electoral rounds. And we know that shrine elites are more averse to literacy. There's another factor which is important, which is that prior to 1977, there was no genuine attempt in expanding the schooling infrastructure. It was in the 1970s that the schooling infrastructure started getting more attention, and you see a real expansion in the schooling infrastructure. And it is in that period that you will see a lot more difference, because now everywhere there's a lot more emphasis on expanding, setting up schools, expanding the schooling infrastructure, and you would see that some regions respond more positively to those than others. Okay, now anybody who's studying on education would know that there are both supply and demand side factors at work. It's possible that in shrine-dense regions, there's less provision of schools. Shrine elites oppose the setting up of schools or restrain public spending on schooling. Or they could make educational infrastructure defective. Now, we show, and I'm not going to go through lots of results here, but we show that the story is a lot more sophisticated than a simple spending or schooling story, that here are these elites who don't want schools to be opened up in their regions, or here are these elites who are actually appointing fewer primary teachers, or they're restraining spending. In fact, we show that in terms of a schooling infrastructure, there's really no difference in terms of shrine, non-shrine regions. Where we do find a difference is in defective provision of schooling. That existing infrastructure is defective, and we present three pieces of evidence based on the data we could find. Again, the huge, for example, if you want to know what is the spending on education in tehsils, we don't have a panel for Punjab. And again, goes back to Dr. Nadeem's point. We had donors, we had government institutions. We don't have very, very basic data that is required to, and this country is suffering from a serious schooling crisis. So the first piece of evidence we present is the schools are more distant. We went to mix, and there are indicators of how far is the school, and we show that systematically in shrine regions, schools are more distant, and especially female schools are more distant. And I spoke a lot of officials in government of Punjab, and they agreed that we can also find they have now GIS mapping systems where they could see siting of schools was a major issue. So because now there were more resources to be earned through schooling infrastructure, they did not block the construction of schools, but sometimes they were made defective and they are more distant. The second piece of evidence we show is that infrastructure is defective in another dimension, which is that a smaller percentage of schools in shrine regions have boundary walls, and larger percentage without electricity systematically. And again, We have results in the paper to support that. And the third factor we emphasized is school size. School size is significantly lower in shrine regions. And whilst in developed countries, the smallest school size, pupils per school, per teacher, right, could be evidence of better quality. But in the context of Pakistan, that is not the case, because as Haris Gusser notes, that the deterioration in standards has been blamed at least partly on the large expansion in the school building program, particularly since the mid-1980s. Growth in the number of schools might have compromised quality by spreading administrative capacity too thinly. And so there's a lot of qualitative evidence to suggest that actually schooling resources were spread more thinly. So we present all of these three pieces of evidence to suggest that in shrine regions, shrine-dense regions, schooling was blocked not by restraining spending or by controlling or reducing the construction of schools, but actually by influencing school provision, the quality of school provision, which then gets reflected in the impact of schooling. Now finally, to conclude, two other factors could be important. If you're an economist, yes, there's a supply side dimension. There's also a demand side aspect. Maybe in shrine regions, there's been a different pattern of urbanization. There are different patterns of exposure to non-agricultural opportunities, which will determine the returns to education. Maybe there's a greater pattern of migration in some regions compared to others, and we are conflating those with these sort of effects. So in the recent version of the paper, we show that urbanization, again, expectedly is a very strong correlate of literacy, but it doesn't knock out the shrine impact. We also show through the mixed survey, again, we have information on households, percentage of households who receive remittances from abroad or remittances from within the country. Again, we show that there's no systematic difference in shrine and non-shrine regions when it comes to patterns of migration. So overall evidence suggests that demand side, while not insignificant, it could be an important dimension, is not doing the full explanation. In fact, the story that we have is consistent with the qualitative evidence that this literacy deficit that emerged in the shrine regions and persists to this day is largely attributable to defective provision of schooling. Now, all of this means that this literature, how do we situate this in the global literature? There's growing literature that suggests that elites oppose development, right? Daron Acemoglu's famous paper in American Political Science Review, Economic Backwardness in a Political Perspective, talks about how elites can oppose development because of what they call the political replacement effect, that they worry that they would be replaced in the future if there's real development. There's been stuff that talks about the role of landed elites in development. But again, this paper is slightly different in the sense that it argues, yes, elites can oppose development. We're talking about particular kinds of elites, religious elites, and we're talking about those religious beliefs, this is a cognitive structure, not just landed elites. In fact, we show in terms of robustness, we've got lots of tests of robustness, but one of which is linked with land inequality. Again, there's a Federal Lands Commission here in Islamabad. It's almost defunct. If you want data on land inequality, is almost non-existent in this country, so you have to go out of the way. So I read a very interesting report in the British Library. It was an inquiry into land inequality in Punjab, and this was written by a British officer in 1920. And he made a very interesting observation. He said, he compiled patterns of land holdings in Punjab, and he said, the perfect correlate for land inequality in Punjab is rainfall. Because as you go from high rainfall to low rainfall regions, land inequality increases. Right? And of course, rainfall is also a shock for income and other characteristics. So when we disaggregate our results by low and high rainfall regions, it appears that the effect is negative in both, but is actually much stronger in the high rainfall region, which is to suggest that yes, literacy in Jhelum is high, but if you look for literacy numbers for Pind Dadan Khan, Jalalpur Sharif, lower. Literacy in Gujranwala is generally higher, But if you are in Sharqpur Sharif, literacy is lower, right? If you are in Sargodha region, Balwal and Bhera Sharif, much less in those regions. Atak, very close from here, has high levels of literacy. But if you look for Pindi Geb, Pir Safiuddin's area, literacy is significantly lower. So it's those differences in the high rainfall regions as well that are very important. Now, all of this suggests that it's hugely important for social scientists to look at data, take hypotheses that are closer to you, to data, and test them, and that could then shape the debate for development. Now, I want to steal 2 minutes of your time to sum up and say, why does this matter? I think one issue that economists talk about is one of external validity. To what extent the findings here apply more generally? And I think the important point here is that it's not just the role of religious ideas per se, it's the way in which religion, land, and politics is the confluence of these three forces which then creates the structural inequality. So it's not the case, it's not an argument about all the shrines. It's about those shrines where religious authority, political authority became co-constituted and was combined with landed power. The second key aspect is that in this country we've devoted lots of resources to literacy promotion, not in terms of expenditures but also in terms of debate. Donors have been talking about it, but very little of the debate on literacy is cast in political economy dimensions. It's often about schools, whether private schools should be better or public. It's often about schooling infrastructure. In Mehboob Haque's days, it was all about we spent far too little on literacy, right? But very little discussion on political economy, the structural constraints to literacy promotion in these regions. And whilst I do not argue that these are the sole determinants of literacy promotion, what I want to highlight is that there are historically embedded factors, right, which can shape Leeds' opposition to schooling. Now, you would be interested to hear that in one of the cabinet meetings, when the discussion came up on abolishing this development spending through M&As and MPAs, one of the people who actually staunchly opposed it was none other than Khusro Bakhtiar. So political elites still want to continue to hold on to those classic instruments of patronage. But the effects that I'm showing here are really about the role and incentives of elites and the structures that enable them. And I look forward to discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Adeel. That was a wonderful presentation. Really like the way you treated the problem. Just one quick question before we go. You argue that Zerla was the major turning point. Was it the development spending from the landlords or whoever, the landlords? Or was it the organization? I mean, it seems to get that there's this combination of factors. Development may just be a phenomenon altogether. And also the fact that democracy also started there. So democracy eventually took up the development spending. So just a bit of clarification there.
Okay, very good question. Because in any of these papers, we need to think about other shocks that are taking place. So we are attributing this to the post-Zia period, and one particular shock within the post-Zia period, which is the way in which public goods were allocated. But there could be other shocks, one of which is urbanization. It's absolutely right. So what we did, I can show you the results, is we controlled for urbanization, and we also ran models of urbanization on shrines. So exactly the same specification, but the deep end is urbanization. And there are no systematic differences. There's a slight negative impact, not significant. And when you include it on the right-hand side, your results will close, which seems to suggest that yes, urbanization is important, because urbanization on its own is strongly positively correlated with literacy. It reduces the impact of education, but doesn't knock it out. So we can at least empirically show that that is not the case. In terms of democracy, I think our basic argument is that two patterns. First, the entry of these shrine elites into politics, and then the manner in which public goods were distributed, both of these remain persistent in the time of democracy, like in 88 So even to this day, we are continuing with the practice of distributing development spending to elected members. With some differences. In every government there's a different program. Sometimes it's Kushal program, sometimes it's other public spending program, but effectively the basic model structure remains the same. And the second factor is that Shrine needs, again, even during political period, right, are persistent in part. So the factors that we are highlighting are having been persistent also. There might be other factors we haven't encountered for, it's possible, but we need to be shown what other potential.
So it's basically the same thing, get money out of politics and put the planning commission into our technocratic setup and central bank so that the development expenses are not politicized. That could be one way of interpreting the story. But anyway, let's go ahead. Anybody, please? Let some kid last one. Keep that one more. The top, anybody else? Okay, there is somebody back there. Let's take the back rows first.
Thank you, Adeel, for such an insightful talk. I've had the chance of attending this talk and talking to the college last year. My question to you is about the effect on the work, like probably it's kind of a comment related to and coupled with the question. When you talk about the religious settings and in terms of shrines and different areas of Punjab and the work of Barbara Metcalf and others, the recent works by Shandana Khan Muhammad and some others, they talk about the political agency of women particularly, and the voting pattern. How do women vote in those areas and in those settings? They come up with the results that they have kind of a political agency, and these are and their work is primarily focused on the areas of Sargodha and they are very kind of in compliance with the earlier works of Sabir Ahmed and other political economists. So my question to you is, one, how do you think all of these shrines and the religious seatings were placed in these areas? For example, Ghera and the Pind Dadar Khan, or in the southern belt there are a couple of Gaddiyan and Shahjeevna and all of others. How do you think there is kind of a certain pattern that these trends are based on? And the second thing is, what do you think is the agency of the women in these areas? Because contemporary studies of by Shandana and all talk about the political agency.
कुछ क्वेश्चंस इकट्ठे करने जी
Thank you, Mohammed Nasir from PIDE. So the mechanism that you explained to which indeed affect the educational outcomes adversely on the literacy rate, you showed it from the supply side. So let's assume that these people don't get into the parliament. Let's assume that they don't have the power. So it means that then they cannot affect these educational outcomes. Because I was also thinking in terms of the demand side, maybe these people who are related to are influenced by the shrines, maybe they have a direct effect on them, but not to go for this formal education. So since that channel is not working, if you are looking from the supply side, they can only affect supply side when they are in the parliament. So if they are not in the parliament, it means then they cannot affect it. And secondly, because you were mentioning, I didn't attend from the start, so if the shrines also include, if these are the peers nizars, how can we separate that this effect is actually from peers or from the nizar? Because we also look into this dynasty problem. We are working on a paper where we look at the impact of dynasties on ADP education, DNR development. We see that there is an increase in the ADP education for different sectors, but the outcomes, for example, there is increase in education for education, but then the outcome is negative. We see reduction in schools and educational outcomes. So that's
Rahman from Qatar University. Actually, my first question is stolen by Mohammed Nasser. So basically, the question is that I think there is a highly, you can say, perfect correlation between shrine beliefs and non-shrine beliefs. So if it is the case, if there is a correlation between them, then your results are overestimated in the sense that the shrine effect may be smaller than the actual effect. So that's the question which Nasser has already asked. My second question is about identification. Although you have explained that there is a significant variation and similarity in shrine allocation, I was thinking that if we can see that Indian Punjab and before partition and Pakistan Punjab, both of them were the same parts. So why the shrine are, most of the shrine are located in Pakistan Punjab rather than Indian Punjab? And it could be the case, that it is related with the revenue generation of the tahsil rather than the non-revenue or low level of revenue generation with tahsil rather than exogenous. And one of the paper, I think it is not published, it's a working paper by Sadhuzar, and they basically calculated the revenue generation at a constituency level and different level of Pakistan and links that revenue generation with the direct and indirect British rule. So it could be the case that these shrines are correlated with the revenue generations rather than exogenous. Thank you.
There is a one paper by Dr. V.C. working with youth and environment sport. They highlighted the idea of this path dependency. And they correlate with this precision backwardness with the formal information. And we also study the same data when we are mentioning data census data there. So if this is the case, we believe on this path dependency, then how you can work from the idea of this path dependency by including this one intervention of 1977. So this is like a sharp contrast in terms of path dependency and the
चलिए जी पहले ये क्वेश्चन आंसर कर लें then we'll do a second round.
Yes, all of them excellent questions. Hafiz, your question about Shandana's book is very relevant. I've seen her book, I'm actually reviewing it. It's a qualitative study of one district, more or less, Saiba. And she's talking about essentially democracy under inequality, right? Rural inequality. Sometimes we give a lot more explanation to patterns of rural inequality and understate the role of agency. Now, none of what I presented counters that view. There might be different patterns of agency, right? But in terms of outcomes, particularly literacy outcomes, we don't see. In fact, 2 days ago I was watching a program by Sohail Varaj, and he was gone ek din Jio ke saath. And he went and interviewed with the Peer of Karbala Sharif, Samsar Bukhari. And I was noticing, how much change has taken place in that area. Roads have been built, new schools have come up. But at least when you look at this longer period, you don't find, in terms of broad aggregate outcomes, you don't find that taking place, right? And again, it's a relative argument. It is possible that there is greater agency in these regions. It's possible that schooling is increased, and we know schooling is increased. The argument is about relative differences, shrine versus non-shrine regions, and post-1977. I think that's the sort of factor that is more important to explore in terms of qualitative studies. People can make this as a frame of reference and then say, okay, let us conduct studies within these regions and see what is going on. This study alone will not be able to answer that, but I obviously admit that there are changes.
You talked about locational patterns, and there was another question that talked about the location of these shrines, particularly Pakistani and Indian Punjab. The location was not truly random, as we know if you read these accounts, early historical accounts. A lot of the peers would be given, directions of the elders of their silsila to go and settle somewhere. But the argument here is that it's not systematically correlated with the regions which are likely to have lower literacy. One way to disprove that is if you would replace our measure of shrine per capita with a measure of universal shrines. If there were a systematic locational factor that should determine that, but in fact we don't find any impact. One particular way in which I find historically significant shrines are located is that they are often closer to the river. If you open Google Maps and see where all these big gullies are, they are invariably along the rivers. And so that's why distance to the river is a hugely important control in our analysis, because that's one of those factors that systematically correlated with these historically significant shrines. You think about peers and zamindars is absolutely central. It's a very good question. We have, for example, included the proportion of landlord from the historic gazetteer, interacted with the post-colonial, tried to include that. We've tried to include for land inequality through rainfall. We've tried to control for land inequality by controlling for a measure of proportion of landlessness in each tehsil. Again, that is important and significant, but it doesn't really take away the impact. So with the data that we have really accounted for it. In terms of dynastic politics, that is true. I think it remains to be shown whether patterns of dynastic politics are different between these different regions, between shrine versus non-shrine. It's also important to recognize that there are a lot of shrines that do not directly take part in elections, but their indirect support is absolutely critical for elections. So, Sial Sharif, for example, they've started participating more actively, but before they were indirect. And that's one way in which landed and non-shrine landed and landed shrines are different, in the sense that in a lot of regions where shrines do not actively participate in elections, still the local MP would be beholden in many cases to these deities because they depend on them for their own time. But I think in terms of political, we try to include measures of political equality by tehsil. We do see that this is a differential effect. It's an effect that's over and above those factors. You also mentioned demand side and spending by dynasties. I think demand side I've already highlighted the factors. If there's an additional factor on demand side, then we can lay our hands on data. We're happy to control for that. But I think your point about spending, a lot of these dynasties spend a lot in their regions, but it doesn't really come up too much into outcomes. And it's partly because of misallocation. I was in Lahore last week, and a senior civil servant told me when we were discussing this, that there was one MP who was constantly pressing him to spend money in Janazah. And he said, I went there, and there were many others, and there was no need for money to be spent on that. But ultimately the MP said, well, this is where all people congregate, and I'm going to have my big placard there, and that will affect. So there's been a lot of misallocation. We need to study how resources have been spent. And resources, there's global literature as well that suggests that more resources in education do not automatically translate into outcomes. The Pakistani Indian Punjab is a very interesting dimension. I don't have data on Indian Punjab, but the contextual evidence I have is that there might be some difference in the penetration of shrines, but there were also very powerful shrines on the other side. Obviously, it depends on where there's a greater concentration of Muslim population, which was really Western Punjab, rest of these tribal regions, where you would see greater penetration. But in UP, there are a large number of shrines. If you look at district gazetteers, it could be an interesting project. But my sense is, without having reviewed the data, is that confluence that I'm talking about between religion, land, and politics was broken long way back in India, because the Waqf departments took over a lot of those shrines. And many of those older shrines, even those in UP and Ahmad that were given land grants by the British, ended up having, they're usually living the life of the living. But on this side of the divide, you have area conflicts because of the political economy factors. Your point about revenue generation is interesting, but I then wonder, a lot of these shrines were set up long before the British arrived. Right? Now, I will explore this question. Maybe even after they were set up, patterns of revenue generation were different. This would partly be linked with the agricultural potential. It would also be linked with Zaildari system, because there are differences in the Zaildari. And if we Zaildars with the principal revenue connectors, and if you look at Zaildari as one of the confounding factors, we include Zaildars per capita, I deliberately don't have that, but it's something to think about. So your question about path dependency, I think the way to think about it is that post-1970s is an effect that is a differential effect. But path dependency is basically an idea about if you start, your starting point matters. If you start with lower levels of literacy, you're likely to have lower literacy. And that we account by including total literacy rate in 1931, which is included in all regressions. And it's negative and significant, which tells us that there is path dependency. Over and above that, we see a differential.
Great, wonderful. Second round. जी, इधर लाइए जी. चलो उधर से पीछे से शुरू करते हैं, फिर आगे लेंगे.
Sir, you have mentioned that peers and Zimidars, and peers are the major source of lack of education, schooling facilities. But I think they are not peers. They are the Gaddi machines. Actually, they are the exploiters of their the names of their ancestors. I think जिनको हमें पता है वो पीर जो है जिनका हम नाम ले रहे हैं या आप बता रहे हैं वो पीर नहीं है, वो हमारे जैसे आम लोग हैं. पीर का जो है पीर तो उनका आपका स्टडी अगर आप डिफाइन करना चाहें पीर को तो मेरे ख्याल में तो ये बिल्कुल इनका लिंक ही नहीं बनता. ठीक है, तो आप अगर देखें तो ये जो बड़े बड़े नाम है जो पॉलिटिक्स में है वो एक्चुअली पीर नहीं है, वो अपने आवाज डाल के नाम को यूज कर रहे हैं इन द पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी और वो लीडरशिप में.
वेरी गुड, ठीक है, थैंक यू. आगे लाइए बिल्कुल है फिर.
Assalamualaikum, I'm Bilal. Rather than asking a question, I would like to share my point of view. That a question was raised that while most of the shrines are situated in the Pakistan region, why not in the eastern Punjab? So in my opinion, rather than saying that shrines are situated in Pakistan, I would say that Muslim community grew around the areas where these saints came and settled. Historically, most of the people embraced Islam through Sufism and saints. So we can say that saints were here, for example, even you mentioned Oghuz and other areas in India, and also in Pakistan. In Sindh, we can say the similar patterns. In Punjab is the same situation, who came from Afghanistan and also from Arabic nations. They came here, settled down. That's why the saints are situated in this region rather than the Indian Punjab.
Raja Hassan, I'm a journalist. Sir, मैंने दो चीजें I just wanted to talk about a couple of things. Number one, you were talking about the heavy rain seasons and where you have more rains, you have literacy rate a bit higher. But I think accessibility of the region, that matters a lot when it comes to literacy rate. Talking about the GT road, as it is a very old road, and I hail from a city that is on GT road. What I have experienced, that accessibility for students over there
if they wanted to grow in education, that really played a key role. And talking about, removal of influence of the peers, that too, GT Road, you see it very less. Whereas in South Punjab and in Punjab and Sindh, South Punjab and Sindh, it's more out there. And the second thing I want to talk about is, in post-Zia time, and even during the Zia time, there was a rise in extremism, and that extremism actually reduced the influence of Sufis, especially the Peers. Why? Because that was systematic, as they required sort of support in Afghanistan that could not be gathered from the Peers, because their fact is that their sect did not allow what was required in Afghanistan. So I believe there is a bit of clash in that.
My name is Mansoor Ahmed. I'm senior fellow with PIDE. 2 points there partially been raised, but nevertheless, I'll ask them. One is, I take your point. I think it's very well made about shrine areas and non-shrine areas. But I wonder if you were to compare shrine areas with similar, like Sardar areas in Balochistan, or big feudal areas here. Perhaps you find a somewhat similar relationship. My second question is that during Ziyar time and subsequently, another thing emerged in a big way, that was big Saudi money and these madrasas, and rise of those mullahs who had many madrasas under their control. So they also came into politics. Maybe some of the data you were showing in their emergence in politics is those people, like Jumiyyat, like Lashkar, like others.
Well, I suppose I'm the last questioner, so not much left for answer. First, you rightly said that elites are not just shrine-based, shrines plus land plus political patronage, and if you're financial patronage, what is I have a question. What was the land ownership plan before the British came in? You may have seen the research done by Dr. Rafiq Ahmed. He did his doctorate at Oxford also. Okay. And it was all being the land ownership in the Punjab. And when the British came, say about 1930, 1940, there was something like 8 ownership, 8 claims to the same piece of land. Starting from the Mughals and the Marathas and the Duranis and then the Sikhs, everything, and the British added to them. So this was a feature. And of course, when the British came, they expanded the system and put up their own, let's say, patronage in place. Literacy rates. Literacy rates, if you just forget the shrine part and non-shrine part or urban versus rural areas, basically literacy rates and literacy is determined by the advantage that literacy brings. And there is no reason to complete education. There is no reason to go even beyond 4 or 5 years. And I'll give you an example. Going back about 25, 30 years ago when Benazir first came to power after Zia. So we got instructions, and I was in the Atomic Energy Commission, that government departments will also hire and go to non-provincial headquarters where they want to hire people. So we were hiring technicians, bachelors, BScs or BTech, first division, only 1 second is allowed between metric and bachelors. So we said, let's think, and we divided up the people from Sindh applicants into rural and urban for half an hour. And so we had a second set of interviews at Dhaka, apart from Karachi. Can you believe it, out of about 85, 90 candidates, we picked only 1. And we were forced to come down to drawing a rectangle 2 by 3 meters and asking people, they were first class bachelor's BSc, what is the area of the rectangle? They couldn't answer that, most many. And what it turned out was, as I said, जी भुट्टो का कामदार होना ज़्यादा फायदेमंद है. पैसे देके 8वीं के बाद 8वीं की जो मर्जी नंबर ले लो, 10वीं 12वीं पैसे देके जो मर्जी नंबर ले लो. So that is the problem, and has nothing to do with shrine zone. Second, political patronage. Literacy rates, there was a census by the British around 1870 when the Crown took over. At Ucheri, for example, Ucheri is a big shrine area. Curiously enough, the literacy rate here was about 90% in this area of Ucheri. Very interesting. So there is a major decline in education from 1857 further down, as you know the background. And I think Irish Christians also highlighted this and others. So, let me share another thing with you. After the planning commission, I went to JFK, and then I got a call from the deputy chairman, Asif Ali. Came along and said, come and see me. He said, does anybody read Vision 2030, which I was involved in formulating? I said, no. Lost in the transition between Musharraf and the new government. At the time, the calendar was such. He said, okay, if I asked you to do one thing, what would you do? Mold people? I said, no. Make people employable. Give them skill. So I was asked to take up a program. I did that. It was approved by the government, never really carried out. And then what I want to share with you is this, that I was made head of the steering committee. Recently to the steering, not the rowing. And we asked for nominations from all the provinces. KP and Balochistan, the ministers of education, nominated themselves. Came to see me, I said, look, you're a minister, I'm not a minister. He said, no, we are excited. The Balochistan minister was interested. I had a long talk with him. He got shot later on, and he was killed. And he said, we hired 5,000 school teachers every year, and we did over 6,000 the year before. I think that's wonderful. He said, no, it's not wonderful. Not a single one of them is working in a school. They're working as gardeners, chowkidars, drivers, or cooks in people's homes. So this is the problem of the rural area. That our schools ki baatein karte hain. How are teachers employed? How are they hired? And what work do they do? Then just one of the things about Golra versus Bari Imam. The two of them here, two big shrines in this area. Golra shot into prominence when Ayub Khan became a fan of the Pir of God. But Bari Imam, of course, is a much older one. And do you know the origin of the word Bari Imam? Why it's called Bari Imam? Has to do with taxation. During the time of Jahangir, the original saint, and people pointed out the original saint versus the descendants. This area was full of darkness and chor, लुटेरे होते थे, कारवारों को लूटते थे. So Jahangir put a tax on people. But he also wanted to meet the Sufi saint here, who refused to go to Delhi, refused to meet him. You know, so then finally he said, what is the condition? He said he could tax him Parika. That's how it was known as Bari. Tax said Bari hua, then Jahangir on his way, come he came in. But interesting, and there's a lot more work to be done, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Another round of very interesting questions. I totally agree with you. It's a question of terminology. I was careful to highlight in my presentation that this is not an argument, a generalized argument about shrines. Sare Peer as in, we are talking about particular types of beliefs, jahan pe religion, land and politics combines. So this is definitely true. It's not an argument about Sufism as such. I think in all of these questions there is an element of nuance, which is very important in such a critical exercise. Dilawar, you offered a comment. I would just add, when we look at application, firstly we don't know how many shrines exist in East Punjab, so I cannot say if they are less or more. But my general impression looking at archives is that they might be slightly lower, but they are not insignificant. There are a large number of those shrines. I think there are some literature, Richard Eaton's work on patterns of Islamization in this part, talks about ecological factors, how a lot of the shrine families got settled in regions, especially close to the river, because there were a lot of people who were not part of the Hindu cultural system. They were unattached to the Hindu cultural system. So there were usually Janglis and other tribes that were easier to
convert. So the ecological factor is there. Your point about accessibility is absolutely important. Again, it's one of those confounding factors which is linked with demand side of education or returns to education that Shaukat Sahib talked about. When people enroll, when they go to school, one of the things that determines the demand for education is returns. And so in any empirical exercise of this sort, it's important to control for exposure to non-agricultural opportunities, access. So we actually included distance to the GP road as a control, distance to Lahore as a control, and the results was present. But it gives you a sense of how you need to account for these different dimensions. One issue that comes up all the time when I present this paper in Europe and US is about this idea that both of you have raised on extremism. So the idea would be, if it is the case that there has been a radical growth of madrasas and it could interfere with our shrine-based explanation in either of the ways. If there are more madrasas, a lot of them could fall into the definition of literacy, of reading and writing is a pretty basic definition later on. Or it might be the case that in these regions it could interfere in other ways. Right? It could be a conforming factor. Now, we don't have a lot of data on this to test this, but we looked at Asim Khaja's report, and he has some numbers on the growth of madrasas. And one of the points he makes is that it's highly inflated. And particularly if you look at individual districts, so there are, for example, in BG Khan, there are people, Saudi return people who are challenging the shrine dynasties, even landed aristocracy. But they are playing as same rules of the game. Right? So their presence is premised on old exclusions. They're using the same tools. And it's not, at least for the period we are studying, and for the differences we are highlighting, it's subsumed somewhere in between. It's not the sort of factor that will come up as a major. But in principle, this is something one needs to explore in a more systematic way. Your other question about tribal Sardar is absolutely spot on, because even the rainfall figures, the low rainfall regions, you saw that the effect was much less pronounced, in part because there the difference between a traditional tribal chieftain and a shrine aristocrat wanes a little bit. Right? The boundaries are there. It is only when you see a lot more in regions where there's more urbanization, when there are different, central Punjab where there's a lot more variation, where these effects get highlighted. You raised a number of questions. I think this question, all of them are kind of relevant, but this particular empirical exercise is very basic in terms of literacy over the long term. Now, the British land policies clearly were not isolated, they were preceded by other land practices, but there's broader consensus amongst the historians that these were radical transformations during the British era, particularly with the establishment of property rights, but also the way in which the whole scheme of rewards got more systematized, like honors, appointments as extra assistant commissioners, provincial levies. A lot of these elites were offered systematic rewards and privileges, which most historians agree were not more systematized. Your question about quality is very important, and that's why we are highlighting that it's the quality of provision. Literacy is a very basic indicator. Now imagine if you get into quality, this whole domain would be even more complicated, and you'll have more. But we are talking about the very minimum criteria that the state sets who is literate or not. Even on that dimension, there's such a massive difference, let alone other important dimensions like quality. Appointment of teachers is a dimension we wanted to test because my hunch is that that will be very, very important. But again, data on teacher transfers or teacher appointments is patchy. We have one regression in the appendix that looks at teachers per school, and there's no difference. And in part maybe because in terms of numbers there is no difference. De jure, there are similar number of teachers, but on the ground they could be very different. Now Punjab had this monitoring unit now, which monitors the presence of teachers, and we looked at that data. And at least for the last 5-7 years there's no difference. I think there are a lot of the, at least in the context of Punjab, a lot of these issues were not more pronounced in the 1980s and 90s. I think your point about the decline in educational and education under the British is very important, because there was literacy before we defined how to measure literacy. Right? And a lot of these shrines played a hugely important role in, they had a civilizing mission. Right? A lot of even women who were not educated at home, they would recite these Bulle Shah Kalam, a lot of other, right? They were important input into social order. But the story I'm painting here is more about the power structure, with the way in which over time hereditary succession of shrine and its combination with landed and religious power, political power, creates elite practice. Yeah.
Sorry, just one small point. Educational data, panel data that you are referring to, I think is very suspect. When I was in the planning commission, I was shocked at the way the education data was being touted. Beautiful growth in educational enrollments. And I said, look, told the section there, even it doesn't happen even in physical sciences. Yet these are human beings. Are there any variations and so on? You could see your graphs and you know what happened? So when I looked at the raw data, about 12 to 15% of school children disappeared. Why? They said, oh, we always want to show a beautiful going up all the time. And second thing, we also, and I'll just stop here, we talk about the power nexus. There's a very interesting nexus with Zamindars, whether they're shrine or non-shrine, and the DMGP.
Yes.
And this continues after they leave the rural areas and move into the secretariats and so on.
Yeah, that's right. I think, as a medical economist, we're constrained by data. If you look at census data, that's probably as best as you get. And you start from the 1901 census. Now, if I assume that the data quality is constant across these regions, which is a big assumption, right? If the data collection methods are wrong, and they're wrong everywhere, it shouldn't affect us too much. Then we control it with the fixed effects as well. But if for some reason this data is particularly problematic in shrine regions compared to others, then these issues might arise. We have to work with data, what is available. I accept there are issues.
Thank you very much, Adeel. Thank you very much. I particularly like the way you described the failure of